Prohibitions are often profoundly revelatory. Often by condemning something, we're actually giving a window onto what's actually being done, as through a kind of negative image. Prohibitions prohibit what's being done. Prohibition implies practice. And this is instructive when it comes to thinking about the history of magic. For instance, in the Hebrew Bible, or the Christian Old Testament, there are about a half a dozen different prohibitions on what we would now take to be various forms of magical practice, including divination. If prohibitions reveal what was actually being done, then we are forced to conclude at some level that magic was actually commonly practiced in ancient Israelite culture. This situation produces a kind of magical paradox. While the letter of the law means that magical practice seems to carry the ultimate sanction, you can think of something like Exodus 22:18, which infamously declares, do not allow a sorceress to live. Machashefa lo techayeh, literally, don't let a sorceress live. We have to conclude that there must have been enough ritual practitioneresses, that they did, in fact, live, because you're sanctioning them to die. The prohibition and the severity of this sanction practically guarantees it. And while Jewish magic therefore seems like a kind of paradox, there can be no doubt that such practices survived and thrived all through Israelite culture and then right alongside rabbinical orthodoxy. And it's in this episode that we're going to explore a very early book, a very early surviving book of Jewish magic, the Sefer HaRazim, or the Book of Secrets, allegedly revealed to none less than Noah by the appropriately named angel Raziel, whose name literally means the secret of God, and was subsequently passed through the generations, only surviving because it was basically lost to history, stored away to be destroyed, and then yet surviving down to this day. And here we find cosmology, angelology, all mixed together with Greco-Egyptian magic, formed into a kind of magical practice for everything from influencing the outcome of horse races, to inquiring into the sun about the nature of the future, to silencing your enemies. This text actually prefigures much of the magical practices that would flourish into the European Middle Ages, and serves as a kind of bridge from the late classical magic to the ritual magic of the medieval period, the sort of classical world of medieval necromancy. So let's explore this fascinating text of late classical Jewish magic, this Sefer HaRazim, the Book of Secrets. Make sure to subscribe here to Esoterica for weekly explorations of topics in esoteric history. And if you'd like to support this kind of work, providing evidence-backed, free, and accessible content here on YouTube, I'd hope you consider checking out my Patreon or taking a look at some of the cool black metal style merch that we have on the channel. If you're new to the study of Western esotericism and you want to kind of get a lay of the land using reliable material, make sure to check out my study guide as well. And if you're actually interested in real historical books of magic and the occult, make sure to check out my bookstore at Esoterica Rare Books. You can find all of those in the links in the description and in the pinned comment down below. But now, let's turn to the Sefer HaRazim, one of the few works of magic surviving from the late classical period. I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and welcome to Esoterica, where we explore the arcane in history, philosophy, and religion. The Sefer HaRazim, or the Book of Secrets, was one of thousands of fragments stored in the Geniza of the Ibn Ezra Synagogue in Cairo. As you may know, many Jewish texts simply can't be thrown away for reasons of religious respect. That is to say that if a text has a divine name written upon it, there's an obligation to not simply discard it as trash. You wouldn't want to trash the divine name, and so you actually have to bury it like a corpse, with all of the attention that goes into a funeral. So such texts are actually gathered together into a place called a geniza to await basically being ritually buried. Now, luckily, the texts held in the geniza of the Ibn Ezra Synagogue in Cairo were never buried for some reason. They just kept piling them up. And as centuries became millennia, the pile grew to enormous size. Over 400,000 texts, fragments, and scraps ultimately accumulated in the Cairo Geniza. And this fact was only really discovered in the late 19th century, and this unique treasure is still being poured over down to this day. And it was in sifting through this massive collection that the scholar Mordechai Margoliot noticed that some texts seem to have a similar structure, similar themes, and similar language. They even seem to share a same scribe. And over the course of 3 years, from 1963 to 1966, he reconstructed this very early magical manual, now from various fragments that we now know as the Sefer HaRazim, or the Book of Secrets. At this point, scholars are dating the original text to sometime around the 3rd of the 4th century of the Common Era, principally on linguistic and cultural grounds. There's also some internal evidence that it dates to that time period. But the text seems to have been composed of two different types of literature talking to one another. On the one hand, the structure of the heavens and the angelology of the text reflect the Merkavah Helios mysticism of late classical Judaism. In this form of Jewish mysticism, the mystic descends, not ascends, descends through various heavenly palaces and must present all kinds of complicated passwords and seals to various terrifying angelic gatekeepers in order to pass closer and closer to the divine throne, which is a form of a chariot, hence Merkavah, chariot mysticism. Once there, the mystic is given a vision of the divine body, measured with strange and exact preciseness, and in some texts even allowed to sit on the divine throne, becoming a being of fire and joining in the cosmic angelic choir to God. This form of pre-Kabbalistic mysticism survives in a pretty substantial amount of text from the late classical period, and it was the dominant form of Jewish mysticism for hundreds of years prior to the composition of the Zohar and the rise of mysticism that we now know as the Kabbalah. Now, I've made an entire separate episode on Merkavah mysticism, just recently actually, if you want to take a look at that in some length. The second type of literature at work in the Sefer HaRazim is the highly syncretistic magical literature of the late classical world, preserved in texts like the vast corpus that we now know as the Greek Magical Papyri. This literature, which is Jewish, Christian, indigenous Egyptian, Roman, they're all fused together into a very complex ritual amalgamation. These magical texts invoke a range of deities for a range of ends, including angels, demons, gods, goddesses, from Thoth to Hermes to Hecate to Christ to the Jewish God, using a range of technologies from magical words, symbols, lamellas, fumigations, magical potions, and on and on. The Greek Magical Papyri are shockingly complex. This highly syncretistic magic reflects the sort of melting pot that was late classical Egypt, especially in the area around Alexandria. Now, I've done an old episode on the Greek Magical Papyri that I need to remake, frankly, but I'm also going to link you to one of the best resources on the Greek Magical Papyri online at this point, and that is the work of Dr. Kirsten Switzer. So I'm going to link you to her if you want to check out more on the Greek Magical Papyri. She does fantastic work there. So what we have in the Sefer HaRazim is a mixture of both Merkabah mysticism along with the syncretistic magic of the Greco-Egyptian world. Recall, this text was probably produced and it was ultimately found in Egypt. Indeed, this text is likely the oldest surviving work of not only Jewish magic, but also the kind of ritual angel magic that would come to flourish much later in the European context, and this text will in some form be transmitted ultimately into Europe. As we have it, the Sefer HaRazim is composed of an introduction revealing the history of the book, itself followed by a group of 7 sections of quite uneven lengths describing the various firmaments of the heavens and their respective angelic encampments. Along, of course, with the military-like divisions of the angelic chain of command, probably based on the Roman legionary system, and perhaps most importantly, the various supernatural powers that can be harnessed by the ritual practitioner by commanding these various angels. The introduction provides the history of the text, or I should say the myth history of the text, which was said to have been revealed first by the angel Raziel to Noah, like Noah's Ark Noah, who then inscribed it upon a sapphire. Now, this idea of inscribing wisdom on gemstones also persists in famous texts like the Emerald Tablet of Hermes Trismegistus, but you also even have Hermetic texts being said to be inscribed on stelae of turquoise and various other kinds of texts. Using the text, Noah gains cosmological wisdom and magical powers, which is better than what he normally did, which was get very drunk. The text itself is then transmitted through the ages until it eventually reaches Solomon, because of course it does, who then uses it to trap and manipulate demons. This is a core concept in the history of Solomonic magic that goes all the way back here, all the way again to the Sefer HaRazim, where of course the text was then eventually transferred down to the prophets, the sages, and then down into its current form as we have it. And in this way, the text is actually establishing its legitimacy. Recall that magic is pretty dicey business in Jewish law, but by following a very similar chain of legitimacy transmission that Jewish law itself is said to have been followed in texts like Pirkei Avot, it's invoking that chain of legitimacy translation to say, look, if halakha, if Jewish law is legitimate, well, so is this book that came from an angel and was passed down in the same way that the law was. Following this introduction, the various firmaments or structures of the heavens, their angelic encampments, the various powers of those angels are all systematically, if somewhat unevenly, revealed. And what I want to do is just take a look at a couple of sections to give you some sense of the heavenly architecture, the numerous angels that populate these regions, and the magical powers that one can expect to acquire while doing this ritual practice. Let's say the second firmament, the second heaven, is said to be full of terror. Yes, this literature is not like you get to go into the clouds and just float and have fun. These are terrifying regions dominated by horrifying angels. And it's said to be inhabited, of course, by countless divisions of angels. Those are military divisions. That level is further divided into 12 sublevels, or malot, each with a host of angels between 9 and 20, who themselves all have commanding officers of various forms. Recall the term Adonai Tsevaot literally means Adonai of the army. It's a military title. The angels are soldiers. And in many Jewish texts, angels are often conceived of as terrifying celestial marines. They're definitely not flying Renaissance babies. That's, by the way, why the angels typically show up in the Hebrew Bible, and the first thing they say is, "Be not afraid." Because when they show up, at least in the Jewish imagination, angels are completely terrifying, and they're frankly often at odds with human existing at all. They hate us. After all, I mean, they did vote against human beings being created at all, according to rabbinical lore. So the angels are not, they're not your friends. But given all that, it is possible the text tells us to approach these guardians of the malot by ensuring that one is ethically and ritually pure. You have to refrain from wine, meat consumption, you have to avoid menstruant, and you have to make use of the various powers. So, for instance, the sixth step contains 17 different angels, which the text names, although we don't really understand what those names are, and we're told that they are humble, but their faces are full of glory. We're then given a magical spell which can cure a person suffering from something like a stroke, so far as we can tell. We're told that, quote, "Take spikenard oil and 3 measures of honey and stand facing the sun as it rises, repeating 3 times each day for 7 days the name of the man and the name of his mother, and the names of those angels who stand upon the 6th step. And on the 7th day, take him and stand him naked before the sun, and smear oil all over his flesh, while burning myrrh, frankincense, and a silver lametta of the names of the angels of glory, with these various characters," and I'll put the characters on the screen, they're magical characters typical of this time period. "Write these characters on an amulet and put it around his neck with a cord of asbestos, along with incense and spices. Write it thus on the 20th day of the month, and you will succeed," apparently curing him of the condition of having the stroke. But here we have a magical ointment, the use of a suffumigation, along with the use of divine names of power on a silver lamella or an inscribed plate, along with a series of magical characters, which again are pretty typical of things like the Greek Magical Papyri, and in fact those characteres survive all the way down into European magic. If you've ever used some of the angelic alphabets found in occult practices, they go back to these various symbols. It's also worth noting here that this has to be done on a specific day of the month, but again, this is the kind of ritual magic you can expect from the Sefer HaRazim. Another spell involves using angels from the 3rd heaven to allow you an edge in horse racing. We get, if you wish to race horses, even if they are exhausted, so that they will continue running and not stumble, and they'll be as swift as the wind, and the foot of no living being will be able to pass them, and they will win popularity in their running, take a silver lamella and write upon it the names of the horses and the names of the angels of that specific malot, and the name of the prince who is over them, the nasi who is over them, and say, I abjure you, angels of running, who run amid the stars, that you will gird with strength and courage the horses that so-and-so is racing, and his charioteer who is racing them. Let them run and not become weary, nor stumble. Let them run and be swift as an eagle. Let no animal stand before them, and let no other magic or witchcraft affect them. Take the lamella and conceal it in the racing lane of the one you wish to win. This spell is interesting for a couple of reasons. One, it was one of the first noticed by Margoliot in 1963, leading basically to the rediscovery of the Sefer HaRazim as a text, but it also helps us to date the text to the late classical period. This is about racing horses and chariots, something that ultimately went out of practice, at least in the Western Roman Empire, by the 6th century, so we get some sense of when this text was being composed. It was composed when they were still doing chariot racing. Now, as I mentioned, the spells range in complexity and detail. There are erotic binding spells, there are spells for interrogating ghosts, there are spells for reversing court decisions, for giving your enemies insomnia, returning safely from war, creating illusory fire, even seemingly banal things like just lighting an oven on a cold day or curing a headache. There's even a spell for seeing the sun at night, which involves a prayer to the Greek god Helios, written in Greek but spelled in Hebrew letters, showing you just how syncretistic this literature can be. The text really just runs the gamut of the kinds of magic that you would expect, but that's exactly what you would expect, syncretism from a magical text. Magical texts are all about deliverables. The angels here that populate this text are also very interesting as well. As we've seen, we already have a text where it mentions the god Helios. While Jewish, this is still betraying a lot of syncretism. Another example, or another few examples of these kinds of angels, is mentioned in the 4th encampment of the first firmament, and it's actually Christos, written in Hebrew letters, but clearly transliterated from Greek. This is a specifically Jewish name, which is quite interesting. And that is, we find in the 4th step of the 3rd firmament, we seem to find something like Koziba and Asmodeus. This is very likely Shimon bar Kokhba, the messianic rebel who was defeated by the Romans in 135, and the demon Asmodeus. Asmodeus, found famously in the apocryphal book of Tobit and ubiquitous in Jewish lore, becomes sort of a popular demon just in general. Here, Bar Kokhba and Asmodeus are angels, strangely enough. The text ends at the 7th and highest firmament, in which dwell the holy chariot along with the throne of God. Here the reader doesn't find any magical techniques, but is simply dazzled, mystically dazzled by the divine light. Indeed, this is very typical of the Helios literature and Merkavah mysticism more generally. And the last section of the text is actually filled with a hymn extolling the fearful glory of God, typical of that literature, of which some of those poems, like El Adon, still survive all the way down to this day in the Jewish liturgy. The Sefer HaRazim is a fascinating window onto both Jewish magical practices of late antiquity, but also a really interesting glimpse into early medieval magic, with a glimpse of what will become the magical systems of later time periods. Indeed, the Sefer HaRazim is a crucial bridge between the magic of the late classical world and the ritual magic, and specifically the angelic demonic magic, the sort of necromantic magic that will come to dominate magic in the European context more generally. Indeed, the text would eventually be translated into Arabic and into Latin, and I have to say that the Latin edition is so significantly different and has a life of its own that I'm going to be coming back to it for a whole episode just on it, just because the Liber Razielis tradition is so distinct as a piece of Solomonic magic that it deserves its own episode, so we'll be coming back to the Liber Razielis tradition all on its own. In some sense, the Sefer HaRazim may be one of the longest continuously practiced books of magic in the Western world, if you think about it. If you want to check out the Sefer HaRazim, the best way to do it is in Michael Morgan's translation, which is shockingly rather inexpensive and has great footnotes. It reproduces the characteres, and you get the Hebrew versions of all the angelic names at the back. You can also check out the Hebrew edition by Margoliot, which is well worth pursuing. though the best edition of the Hebrew is Bill Rieberger and Peter Schaeffer's edition, which contains 2 macroforms of the text, along with some translations from the Latin material as well, along with a very good introduction, but the translation's into German, not English, just FYI, and it's very expensive. The Hebrew also of this text isn't terribly difficult, though the exact pronunciation of many of the angelic names remains quite mysterious. So exactly how to do the magic if you can't pronounce the angelic names, I don't know. I can't help you. Regardless, a foundational and often overlooked book in the history of Western magic. Of course, more books of magic to come. And until then, I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and thank you for watching Esoterica, where we explore the arcane in history, philosophy, and religion.